If you drink coffee, you're going to want to hear this. It might be about to get a lot more expensive in the United States because of Trump's tariffs.
For decades, coffee imports entered the United States largely duty-free, but now some of America's top trading partners are facing double-digit tariffs on their imports, including coffee.
Is so large that it's going to really affect the price of the coffee.
What happens when something as ordinary as a morning cup of coffee suddenly turns into a financial burden? Across the United States, millions of households are waking up to a reality they never expected. The price of roasted coffee on grocery shelves has jumped nearly 21% in a single month compared to last year. For small families, breakfast routines are no longer automatic. They are calculated decisions. The story doesn't stop with retail shelves. Import data reveals that a 50-pound bag of Brazilian beans, once a reliable backbone of American supply chains, has soared from roughly $147 to more than $350 after new tariffs took effect. That kind of spike doesn't just inflate invoices on a balance sheet. It forces a cultural shift in how people live their mornings. More and more consumers now brew at home, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Meanwhile, small cafes in New York, Washington, and Chicago have begun sounding the alarm. Some owners openly admit that a 50% tariff could push them to close their doors. If coffee, of all things, can become a luxury in America, the obvious question follows: what everyday comfort might be next? The root of this shock traces back to Washington. After months of fiery rhetoric, the Trump administration turned words into action, announcing a sweeping 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee imports beginning August 1st, 2025. The target was clear. Brazil, the single largest supplier to the American market, provided roughly one-third of the beans that fill U.S. cups each morning. Yet, the policy meant to project strength immediately lit a fire under global markets. Futures contracts for Arabica coffee on the Intercontinental Exchange surged by nearly 50% within days, catching roasters and importers off guard. Analysts argue that the shock was not about supply vanishing overnight, but about the uncertainty injected into every deal, every contract, every delivery schedule. That uncertainty quickly filtered into the numbers consumers feel most directly. The Consumer Price Index of coffee in American cities rose almost 12% year over year, reinforcing the sense that this wasn't a temporary market adjustment. It was the start of a prolonged storm. Was this tariff a bold negotiating tactic or the spark that triggered an economic chain reaction Washington could no longer control? The ripple effects of this decision did not remain confined to trading floors. They cascaded straight into the balance sheets of American businesses. From family-run cafes to large import chains, the cost of keeping coffee flowing has doubled, turning an entire sector into what many describe as a hostage of trade policy. Industry estimates suggest that a single container of green coffee, once manageable, now commands between $150,000 and $200,000, roughly twice its earlier cost. For small roasters like Sputnik Coffee, the squeeze has been even sharper. Company representatives admitted they were paying nearly double the old price, plus an additional margin, within just half a year. Unable to absorb such increases, some roasters began liquidating equipment, while others shuttered their operations entirely. Importers, faced with impossible margins, delayed or canceled contract with Brazilian suppliers, creating further disruption along the supply chain. In effect, the American coffee industry was forced into a precarious standstill, not because demand disappeared, but because the economics of survival no longer added up. As businesses faltered, the cultural heartbeat of coffee in America began to skip. Coffee is more than a commodity. It is ritual, identity, even a form of social glue. Yet under the weight of soaring prices, that culture has started to wobble. Stories from everyday consumers capture the shift. Helena, a 29-year-old office worker in Washington, admitted her morning cup had become a financial burden. What was once a small comfort before work now forces her to make choices about where else to cut back. Among younger professionals in cities like New York and D.C., cafe visits have quietly shifted from daily staples to weekend luxuries. Meanwhile, hedge funds and large investors are exploiting the volatility, pushing coffee futures higher with no clear ceiling in sight. For ordinary consumers, even home brewing offers little certainty or stability. And with the United States lacking large-scale domestic production outside limited regions in Hawaii and California, the market has few safety nets to cushion the blow. While the U.S. market stumbled, Brazil wasted no time rewriting its playbook. For decades, American demand had been the cornerstone of Brazilian coffee exports, shaping everything from planting cycles to long-term investment strategies. But once tariffs upended that relationship, Brazil pivoted with striking speed, directing volumes toward new partners. Within months, shipment began flowing more aggressively into China, Europe, and the Middle East, redrawing the global coffee map almost overnight. China has quickly emerged as the anchor of this reoriented trade. By 2024, it already represented more than a quarter of Brazil's total coffee exports, a share that only deepened as the U.S. slipped into single digits. Responding to rising consumption and political incentives, Beijing authorized an additional 183 Brazilian companies to sell directly into its market. The move signaled that these trade lanes were not just temporary adjustments, but institutionalized for long-term growth. Critical to this transformation has been the backbone of logistics. Over the last decade, Chinese-backed investments in Brazilian ports, railways, and storage hubs quietly created a network capable of rerouting cargo with far less friction. The result is a supply chain that can bypass bottlenecks, shorten delivery times, and sustain larger volumes without leaning on U.S. buyers. For Brazil, the transition has been painful but ultimately adaptive. For America, it has meant watching a once stable commodity transform into a volatile luxury. At its core, this story is about more than tariffs or trade disputes. It is about the everyday fabric of life, about how something as small as a cup of coffee can reveal the fragility of larger systems. When a simple morning ritual turns into a budget calculation, the ripple effects extend far beyond kitchens and cafés. They reach into how people feel about stability, culture, and even identity. Coffee has always been a symbol of comfort. Now it is a reminder that even the most ordinary routines can be reshaped by global politics. For American importers, the signal is impossible to ignore. The dependable flow of beans that once defined their operations is now being siphoned into regions where demand is treated as strategic, not merely transactional. The United States has slipped from preferred destination to peripheral market, while Brazil positions itself at the center of a new global coffee order. What was once a golden market for exporters has turned into a no-go zone. For decades, the U.S. was more than just a buyer of Brazilian beans. It was a showcase of stability, an anchor that justified long-term contracts and steady investment. Under the weight of tariffs and rising costs, that perception has eroded. At one time, nearly 17% of Brazil's coffee exports were directed to American buyers. Today, a significant share of those shipments has been postponed, rerouted, or canceled outright, leaving exporters scrambling to adapt. Industry figures paint a sobering picture. By July 2025, Brazilian green coffee exports to the U.S. had fallen by more than a quarter compared with the previous year. Trade groups like Cafe have gone further, warning that with current price distortions, shipping to the American market is not just unprofitable but strategically unwise. From their perspective, continuing to serve a shrinking, volatile market risks undermining Brazil's long-term positioning in regions where demand is growing on the ground. The implications are harsher still. Containers sit idle in warehouses or ports, racking up storage fees and pushing average losses to roughly $10 per bag. For farmers and cooperatives already facing squeezed profit margins, those costs translate into a daily erosion of value. Some have been forced to renegotiate credit lines, while others divert capital away from reinvestment simply to absorb the shock. Perhaps the most striking development is how quickly this retreat has been normalized. What began as a temporary response to tariffs is now hardening into a structural shift in the coffee trade. Exporters no longer talk about waiting out the storm. They are actively redirecting supply chains, building logistics capacity elsewhere, and signing contracts that bypass the U.S. entirely. The symbolic weight of losing such a major buyer is undeniable. But for Brazil, the calculation is clear. Clinging to the American market may no longer be worth the cost. The space left behind by America's retreat did not remain empty for long. Competitors, allies, and rivals alike moved swiftly, turning absence into advantage. Among them, Canada distinguished itself as one of the most agile players on the board. Without a comparable tariff shock rippling through its economy, Canadian coffee imports remained steady and consumer prices at home barely shifted. That sense of normalcy gave local roasters and distributors something invaluable: credibility. For small businesses and retailers in the U.S. suddenly cut off from affordable beans, Canadian firms became more than partners. They became lifelines. In effect, Canada began exporting stability, quietly sliding into niches that American companies could no longer defend. At the same time, the global appetite for Brazilian coffee only seemed to intensify. Europe and Asia, already among the world's largest consumers, saw U.S. turbulence as an opening to negotiate stronger ties. In Beijing, the moment was seized with characteristic speed. Officials and traders worked to secure multi-year agreements, not only to meet current demand but also to insulate against future disruptions. The result was a rebalancing of flows that left Brazil more interconnected with Eurasian markets than ever before. For secondary producers like Colombia and Vietnam, the shift proved to be a windfall, albeit on a smaller scale. Their lower tariffs and favorable trade relationships allowed them to capture incremental contracts, particularly in mid-tier markets where price sensitivity mattered most. Yet experts caution that the infrastructure and scale required to rival Brazil simply do not exist in these countries. Their roles, while profitable, remain supplementary rather than transformational. What emerges is a trade landscape where the absence of the United States has reshaped incentives. Canada gains stature as a reliable channel. Asia deepens its position as a central hub, and Brazil cements itself as the indispensable supplier at the heart of the system. America, by contrast, finds itself sidelined, paying higher prices while competitors build stronger, more resilient networks. One tariff, one policy decision, has sent shockwaves through the world's coffee chain, stripping the U.S. of a market position it once took for granted. What used to be a cohesive, predictable trade has splintered into a fragmented system where volatility and geopolitics shape every shipment. The consequences stretch far beyond beans and cups. America's reputation as a reliable trade partner has been damaged. While buyers across the globe increasingly view Europe and Asia as safer harbors, U.S. consumers bear the irony. The very people who were supposed to be shielded by protectionist measures have instead become the ones paying the steepest price. And that leaves a haunting question. If even a morning coffee can be turned into a luxury, what does that say about America's future as a hub of global commerce? The coffee